Thanks again for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Gavoni.
Thanks, Maren. So I have two very brief slides to kind of set up the main show, which is Casey's 10 slides that, if you guessed it, they're heavily data influenced slide, but I think that they set up an argument for what we're trying to do in Thrive 2050 that we'd love your feedback over the summer. We're going to continuously refine the goals in Thrive 2050, and we really want your input and your feedback because this is your plan too. But first I want to start off with what is Thrive and what can it do? So Thrive 2050 is a general plan. A general plan is a policy document. It does not change zoning, but what it does do is it guides over multiple decades how a jurisdiction will develop and change over time, how we'll respond to future opportunities and challenges. For example, a huge challenge that we're dealing with right now is COVID, and how can we respond as a jurisdiction when future pandemics, hopefully there's not a future pandemic, but how do we respond to future change like that? And unlike a sector plan or a master plan or a functional plan, a general plan does not provide specific land use guidance. It does not say this parcel is given an FAR of 1 and a height of 70, but it does address multiple topics like housing, transportation, and the environment and the economy instead of just one. And Thrive will have an implementation chapter. Everything that you see in Thrive contains goals, policies, and actions that require implementation. And we will have short-term, mid-term, long-term recommendations on how we can achieve implementation. And this includes land use facility, infrastructure plans. It also includes capital improvement projects and zoning and other regulatory tools that we need to make these changes. And so we're gonna dive right in to everyone's favorite conversation. So Thrive Montgomery 2050 recommends modest increases of density in areas that are zoned exclusively for single family housing near what we call high capacity transit, which is the purple line. I know the purple line's a touchy subject right now, but it's the purple line, the red line, and our BRT stations. And it provides housing types like duplexes, triplexes, and small apartment buildings that blend in seamlessly with the neighborhoods. When we talk about these modest increases of density, we're really talking about the middle densities. We're not talking about huge apartment buildings like the one I live in. We're talking about small, middle densities that can seamlessly blend into neighborhoods. And we think missing middle is really important. We don't ever say the word missing middle, at least in the attainability chapter. We really call out the types by name, the duplexes, the triplexes, the quads, because our hope is in 50 years, they're not missing anymore. But these choices are really important in our goal of addressing past inequities and constraints on housing choice, and also creating more housing in Montgomery County that is affordable and attainable for people of all incomes. I want to say that we actually posted an FAQ on thrivemontgomery.com today that really goes into detail about a lot of the recommendations, not just housing, but our vision, implementation, as well as other chapters. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to the chair.
Thanks, Lisa. Let's get into this so we can get to the questions. This slide shows the number of building permits issued for residential dwelling units in every year since, what is that, first year, 1980. So what you see from this slide is, from the left, we used to have years where they were pretty routine in the 80s, where you'd get 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 plus units a year. That slowed way down in the 90s, picked back up a little bit in the early 2000s, but the long-term trend has been down. Meanwhile, the population continues to increase at a pretty steady pace, not explosive growth at any point in the last couple of decades, because we're already starting from a pretty large base. So in percentage terms, it's down to less than 1% a year within the last 2 decades. Now we're at like maybe 0.6 to 0.8% population increase a year, but it's steadily increasing, as has the employment base. The number of jobs in the county, in the region, has slowly and steadily increased. So the housing stock has really continued to, the supply of new housing has continued, the rate of production has continued to decline over time. And there was a moderate recovery in 2012, 13, 14. But as you see over there on the right end of the graph, we're now down again. So you would expect that that trough around 2009, when there was the economic crash, you would expect that housing production would crater. But really, we have not seen a full recovery since then. And over the last decade, we've had really anemic housing production. So the point here is we're just not producing very much housing. And COG recently put out a target that was embraced by all the DC area jurisdictions. We would really need to produce, I think, in the range of 5,000 units a year for the foreseeable future if we're going to meet the COG target for our proportionate share of housing to match the growth in population and jobs. That's the basic overall problem that we're facing with supply of housing in the county and in the region. Can we see the next slide? This slide is the most interesting thing I have seen in probably 2 years. And our research group put this together. I think this is just really amazing. What this shows is the percentage of each household type and how many people live in each household in the county over time since 1960. And what you see is that over there on the left, in 1960, 7% of households in the county consisted of one person living by themselves. Today, over there on the right, or 2018, last year, where we have data available, it's 25%. So the proportion of households that consist of one person has increased by a factor of 3.5 since 1960. That is a profound social change that I think is driven by economic change as well as political and technological factors that have influenced our society. But what it means is that we got a lot more people living by themselves as opposed to being coupled up, or what was much more common in 1960 was a married couple with children living at home. Next slide. Even as the number and proportion of households consisting of multiple people has declined, the size of single-family houses has continued to increase. So you see, used to be single-family houses typically under 1,600 square feet. New single-family houses today are well above 3,600, going towards 4,000 square feet. That's a dramatic increase in the size of each single-family house, but it's especially striking when you put that together with the last slide and you see how proportionally we have a lot more people living by themselves. Now, there are single people who like to live in single-family houses, but I think you see my point here that single-family houses are particularly well adapted to couples living with children at home, and yet we see bigger and bigger houses at a time we got higher proportion at least of smaller households. Next slide. The results are predictable. We have lots of renters living in small units with fewer bedrooms than people. Next slide. And the flip side of that is we see more and more people who are owners, and these are typically more likely to be single-family detached dwelling units. Not always. Obviously, there's condominiums, and some people rent single-family houses, but there's a pretty strong relationship between the building type and the ownership or rental status of a dwelling unit. And what this shows is there's a pretty significant, maybe is in the range of 18,000 plus housing units in the county where there are more bedrooms than people. Now, obviously, some people, as I said, sometimes single people like to live in single family houses. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes people of whatever household size like to have an extra bedroom or a home office. So I'm not going to say that every single one of those 18,000 houses necessarily is oversized relative to what the people who live in it would like or need. But I think it's pretty clear that there's a significant number of people who are overhoused. In particular, when you've got like 1 or 2 people living in a 5-bedroom house, that seems like a pretty good sign that there's a mismatch between the housing stock and the size of the household. Next slide. You might ask, how do we get in this situation? Is this just the market at work, or what's driving this sort of misalignment between housing stock and households? This box graph shows that about almost 37% of the land area in the county is zoned for single-family detached housing. There are some cases where townhouses or some very minor degree of infill is allowed with some other dwelling types. So basically, you've got over a third of the county is zoned for single-family detached houses. So if you are a property owner, you're a builder, you're a real estate developer, you might like to build something other than a single-family house, but you don't have that option in more than a third of the county's land area. And you see that 2.3% of the land in the county is zoned for multifamily housing. So we have a whole lot of land that is set aside exclusively for single-family houses, very little land that accommodates multifamily development. Next slide. This is important not just because there's misalignment between the housing types or sizes that are suited to the size of the household, but because being able to buy a house is, for better or for worse, one of the most important ways that people in the United States are able to build wealth. If you can't afford to buy a house or a condominium, one obvious straightforward way to accumulate capital is not open to you. So the ability to pass on wealth between generations is limited. The ability to cash out equity in your house to start a business or build an addition or meet some unexpected need that your family might have, that's off the table if you can't buy. Now, I'm not a big advocate for saying that we should try to necessarily push people to be home buyers as opposed to renters. I think there's good reason to believe that maybe we've overdone it on home ownership in this country historically, but certainly if that avenue is not available to people who want it, the question is, what does that mean for our ability, for the ability of people to move up not just the income ladder, but the wealth ladder to improve their position economically over time? Because even if housing doesn't appreciate, it's still a form of forced savings. As long as you make your mortgage payment every month, then in 30 years, you're going to own an asset that you can sell, and that represents the biggest single piece of most people's nest eggs. Next slide. This obviously has a connection to the racial wealth gap. There's been a lot of writing about this by academics and the popular press about the ways in which the government at the federal level, at state and local level, over time, almost everywhere in the country, and in many, many ways, made it difficult or impossible for African Americans in particular, not only to buy housing in particular neighborhoods, but get access to capital, to loans, to allow them to buy into housing as a way to invest, and also a way to get access to neighborhoods where there are a lot of opportunities. I mean, today we think about things like access to transit and jobs, but it's broader than that. It's about access to good schools. It's even about proximity to jobs. So even if you're not right next to a transit line, at least you don't have to drive an hour or more each way back and forth to work. So that's really important to understanding why it is that we're in a situation today where people of color, particularly African Americans, have in many ways been left out of some of the avenues for upward mobility that have been available to white Americans over a period of generations. And so that's one of the dimensions of this discussion about missing middle that I think is important, because providing more housing types, smaller units, multiple units that are perhaps attached on smaller lots, is one way to make ownership attainable for a broader cross-section of people. And that has socioeconomic elements to it. It's also a racial issue. And that's why a lot of people are talking about this as one step towards addressing racial inequality. And I think that is probably the last slide. So just wanted to provoke some conversation and also explain some of the reasons why, in addition to affordability, the planning department, and certainly I believe that missing middle housing is a really important step in the general plan, and it's important that we try to introduce it through our other land use regulatory processes to open up those options.
Hi. All right. Sorry, I'm hearing about a train coming on a bus from my toddler. So we have a number of questions that have come in. So I'd like to hop over to the questions we've received. But first, I just wanted to remind people about how to participate. So it looks like people have found the chat window because we've gotten lots of chats, which is wonderful. And feel free to respond to each other as well as ask questions. You can also raise your hand to speak by clicking on the participants icon, and then we'll call on you. Some of you who have asked questions, I've asked you if you'd feel comfortable saying your question out loud, and some of you have agreed. So we'd love to have people state their questions verbally so we can just get to know who's in the room and who's here. So with that, I would like to ask Jane Lyons to direct her question to Lisa and Casey.
Hi, good afternoon. So my first question, I'm sure I'll have many hopefully, is about specifically action 5.1.1.a that specifically mentions duplexes, triplexes, and quadruplexes, and making it easier to build these and align them by right. My question is, does the draft plan as it is now do anything to address small apartment buildings that are in the range of like 5 to 20 units? Thanks.
Hi, Jane. Long time no talk. That's a great question. So when we talked about missing middle specifically in the plan, we're mostly talking about duplexes, triplexes, and quads. There's obviously a place for small apartment buildings that in Montgomery County that we need to look at. So that's a good question. I think, we need to figure out how, and this might be a future work program item when we look at, future master plans, is how do we properly transition from, along the corridors with single family homes and the missing middle, and then use small apartment buildings and then, tier up. So I think there's definitely a place for that, but you're right, there is not a lot of guidance on that in the general plan.
Thank you, Lisa. I was just seeing if Jane had a follow-up. So another question that we've received throughout this process has been about single-family housing, single-family zoning, and kind of what's going on with it? What's the big deal right now with single-family zoning, not just in Montgomery County, but all over the country? We're hearing these conversations nationally. And could you just talk about the moment that we're in and why we're looking at single family zoning? Casey, you had mentioned missing middle housing as well as some other housing types that we hear less about.
Yeah, I think that there's at least two parts of it. One is just generally affordability, that smaller units on less land are going to tend to be more affordable. We'll come back to that, I guess. But I intentionally wanted to talk about this issue of household structure and formation, because I think it's important for people to realize, affordability aside, we have a very significant disconnect between the housing stock that is built in the county, that the county is zoned to accommodate, and the way that people actually live their lives in 2020. So we have a 1960, alignment of housing and zoning to the population and to the way people are living, and we really need to bring that 60 years up to date. So even if there were no affordability question, there'd still be an issue of there's a lot more people living by themselves for a whole variety of reasons. Both, it's not just, people who are not coupling up early. It's also people who may never get married, or they get divorced, or they become widowed. There's a whole variety of reasons for that. That's probably several doctoral dissertations to get into all the reasons behind that, but it's a fact. That's a huge social and economic change that's happened pretty much unremarked in land use planning. I have not really seen a lot of attention to that in the academic literature, in the conversations that I have had with planners over the last decade plus that I've been involved with this. And that's why I thought that slide that I showed that was produced by our research group that just knocked me off my chair, because I guess I recognize that there are more people staying single for longer, and there's more people living longer, so they may outlive their spouse by a number of years. But that really hit me hard, the idea that the proportion of people who are one person, households that are just one person, is 3.5 times higher than it was 60 years ago. That's just, I think that's a profound change that, if for no other reason, we need to address our assumptions about how the county's land use is handling that and planning for that.
I agree with Casey. I said, one thing that I think is missing from this conversation is that we keep talking about missing middle housing, and missing middle housing is an important part of increasing our housing supply and increasing the types. But one of the things that I consciously did in Thrive is when I talk about duplexes and triplex, I also want to mention SRO, supportive housing, and co-housing, and co-ops, and other types of housing that meets all AMI, everyone on the AMI spectrum, and all the different types of housing. Because I think it's really important when we talk about this idea of complete communities and mixed income, that we're talking about all incomes and all households.
Thanks, Lisa and Casey. So this is a virtual happy hour. I don't know how people are feeling right now. I'm feeling a little tired from the day. I am drinking my fancy root beer. So feel free to show us what you're drinking. And we're going to take a little break, relax from the numbers and from the data. And Casey is going to share with us one of his favorite drinks. I believe he just looked up, and feel free to tell us what you're drinking. Like last time we had some interesting local beers that people were drinking. Mine, unfortunately, is a Maine root beer, so not local, but let me know if you have a favorite local root beer. And I'll pass it over to Casey to share his.
Okay, so today we're gonna talk about mezcal, which is a little complicated. Last time I did an old fashioned, which is relatively straightforward. And I should mention, we wouldn't want to suggest that you have to drink alcohol to have a good time. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these ingredients without the alcohol, but I think mezcal is kind of an interesting form of spirit. I just maybe tried it for the first time earlier this year. I ordered it at a restaurant. It made me curious. And I looked up all these mezcal recipes, and they're all unbelievably complicated. So this is a simple one. This is called the Paloma. And all you do is you get some mezcal. And by the way, I should say mezcal is made from agave, which is the same plant that tequila is made from. All tequilas are technically mezcals, but not all mezcals are tequila. The difference in what you buy when you buy a bottle of mezcal instead of tequila is it tends to have a smokier taste because of the way that it's dried out over a wood fire or coal fire. That's really the distinctive feature of it. But if you pour 2 ounces of mezcal in a glass over an ice cube, and then I really like this grapefruit soda. It's a little bit tricky to find. This you can't find it in every grocery store, but if you can find it, I'd recommend it with or without the alcohol. It's really great in the summertime. You're gonna just pour the grapefruit soda over the mezcal and ice, just like that. And probably add just a little bit of lime juice. Now, if I were really gonna do this the right way, I would probably salt the rim, but I don't have any salt with me, and it's fine without it. But it's really that simple. If you can't find any grapefruit soda, you can use squirt. This is the authentic Mexican squirt that uses cane sugar. It's just like Mexican Coke has cane sugar, which a lot of people who are soft drink snobs would say is the best kind. But you can use any old squirt. I wouldn't recommend using diet. It just doesn't work very well as a mix. But that's it. You've got the grapefruit soda. If you can't find grapefruit soda, you could also use grapefruit juice and some soda water, same idea. And then add a little bit of simple syrup in order to give it that sweetness that you'd get with the grapefruit soda. So that's it. A Paloma.
Thank you, Casey. That looks delightful. And Casey was telling us that it's difficult to find grapefruit soda. So if you have any hot leads on where to find it, you can also share that with us.
Yeah, I ordered mine on Amazon, which is maybe a little over the top, but it's, that's how we're getting a lot of things with coronavirus going around. So let's have that option.
So now I'd like to jump over to Christina, and I'm just going to have to find her to unmute her. But Christina had a question about why and how we're planning for more units, and I'll let her ask it. Christina, are you able to unmute? Oops, let's see.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
now.
great. I think you unmuted me and then I muted myself again. So my question is, why are we looking to increase housing units? I think the number I heard was 5,000 units each year to keep up with demand. Do we actually have the space to do this? And are we trying to meet demand without the space? Can you talk about this and how perhaps we can avoid high density areas which can make our Montgomery County less attractive to live in? How do we address these issues, and what is your plan for meeting the demands?
Well, that's why I like to show that first slide, which shows we're actually not producing very much housing by historic standards. I know a lot of people don't, that's not consistent with what they perceive to be going on. I mean, they see construction going on in downtown Bethesda, or in Silver Spring, or even in Wheaton or White Flint, and they say, oh my God, what is with all this development? And the fact is, there's just not really that many units being produced. I think what's different is, as recently as the 90s or early 2000s, a lot of new development was occurring in greenfields. It was farms that were being subdivided in places like Clarksburg, further, up the 270 corridor to north and west. And so if you didn't live in that part of the county, you probably didn't even see it. Over the last decade plus, there's been more interest in living in urban areas, and more people want that. So it's not just a question of running out of space for new subdivisions of single family houses on big lots. It's also a change in what people are looking for. They'd rather not have to drive long distances just to go get a jug of milk, or much less every day to drive to work. And so there's been more demand for, living in places like downtown Silver Spring, downtown Bethesda. And so I think I don't really agree with the premise that we're out of room. In fact, I think the good news is that people want to live in urban areas. More people want to live in urban areas, not everyone. And in fact, not everybody wants to live in an urban area, or necessarily in a suburban or a rural area, for their entire lives. Young people have shown an increasing preference for living in places that have access to transit and are walkable. But older people, like my parents, who are in their 80s, moved first to Silver Spring and then to Wheaton, because they were finding it was difficult to get around in a car. They didn't like the idea of having to maintain a house and to have to drive everywhere to go to a doctor's appointment or go to the grocery store or whatnot. So even in some ways, I think the period of life when people want something different than what we think of as the typical suburban, house at the end of a cul-de-sac and a single family house with a big yard, it's not that that has gone away. It's that that serves people, more and more people are finding that serves a more limited portion of their lives and meets their needs for a proportionally shorter time when they actually need to have a place to live in order to satisfy all the needs that they have for access to amenities and jobs and transportation, and also something they can afford and something that they can maintain. So I think the short answer is there is space, and that's going to require that there be some moderate intensification of housing in some areas, but with almost 37% of the county is zoned exclusively for single family houses right now. The good news is that there's room to accommodate duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, the kind of very sort of modest increases in intensity that we're talking about in this general plan without really transforming the character of any neighborhood, probably, and certainly not changing it except gradually over time.
Great. I would say, just piggybacking on what Casey says, the COG housing targets are a recognition that we haven't done a great job of meeting our housing need. It's saying that we expect that we will have 31,000 households coming to Montgomery County in the next 10 years. And so we're expecting 31,000 household units, and that we need to go above that by 10,000 to meet what we have not been producing, to create downward pressure on the market and to create more supply in Montgomery County. So it's a recognition of that. And I view Thrive as kind of a work program of how we can build more housing. But we also need to recognize that there's other parts of housing policy that we need to talk about: tenant protections, homelessness, fair housing, preservation policies. And all of that together can help us meet our COG housing goals and create a more inclusive housing policy for Montgomery County.
Thank you, guys. So I'm going to shoot it over to Mike English, who had a few questions, and then I'll share a few similar related questions to single family zoning. All right, Mike.
All right, how you doing? Yeah, so I just had a question on if there's any detail on the split, or if they would just give the flexibility for either on both increased density in owner-occupied and renter units. Like I rented in downtown Silver Spring for 7 years. Like renters need places to live too. I think we need more of both. But like I recently bought one of the few like relatively affordable condo buildings near downtown, and there's not very many there. To my understanding, most of the things in the pipeline that got in before the moratorium went through are rentals. Do you know if there's any plans, whether it's duplexes, triplexes, or like a 4-story, like my building's about 45 units, if there's anything that's in there? And just again to piggyback on that, like yes, I definitely agree the affordability programs, the MPDUs and stuff like that are important, but I think we sort of have a tendency to say we do that and say that's enough, and like it sounds like there's sort of a realization there.
Well, I will say Stephanie Kaling, who's not going to come off video or chat, but one of the things, and she's the housing chief at DHCA, and one of the things she told me when we were talking about this is, the MPD program is great. It does a lot, but we can't rest our hopes and dreams for affordable housing on the MPDU program. And that's always stuck with me, because I think we can strengthen the MPDU program, and we have, and we will continue to do so, but we need to look at other innovative financing, construction tools to build more housing. And your other question about missing middle and ownership, I think that's a huge part of it. When we did the housing needs assessment, we saw that the average household can't afford the average home in Montgomery County. We know we need to look at things that are more affordable by size. We know that a duplex in Bethesda is still going to be $800,000 per side. Like we know that, but we know there's opportunities in other parts of the county to look at more affordable options, and we have to put it all on the table. And we know that ownership is the best way to build wealth in this country. And millennials they're not owning homes like their predecessors. So we need to figure out ways to create access to stable homeownership units in Montgomery County. And missing middle is part of the strategy. It's not the sole strategy, but it's part of it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So we've gotten a few questions, unsurprisingly, about single-family zones. Bill Leroy says that he'd like to see more relaxed zoning inside the single-family home zones for triplexes and quads. And then we also had questions from Jay Susie about where in the county we're looking at putting in missing middle. Is it in places like Silver Spring and Rockville, she says, or where else? And then we also had a question from Cheryl Gannon asking, is there a zoning classification that would limit what is built in a neighborhood to duplex, triplex, and quad, but not apartment buildings? Lisa, could you address some of these related questions?
Sure. So I'm going to put on my technical zoning hat right now. So the R60 zone and most of the detached residential zones actually do allow alternate housing types up to duplexes. They do not allow triplexes, but the issue with the single family zone and getting to that type is that the zones haven't been changed in a very long time. So they have, for example, the R60 zone has a usable area requirement of 3 acres. Which is, if anyone can find 3 acres of R60 in Downtown County, please let me know. It also requires the optional method of development, which is an alternative. It's a development type that requires basically discretionary plan review. So it adds a lot more process. And when you compare that to, let's say, tearing down and rebuilding a single family home and then, creating a much bigger single family home, the process to do that is by right. So you can go straight to DPS. You never have to come to the planning department. So it's much harder to build a duplex in the single family zones than it is to build a single family detached home, which is why most do not do that. So it's a process question. What other questions do we have, Maureen?
Oh, well, I wanted to address this question about that Cheryl Gannon asked about, is there a way to limit it? And the answer is yes. Every zoning classification is basically a ceiling. So, for example, in downtown Bethesda, there are still a few single-family houses that are on land that's zoned for apartment buildings. You can build a less intensive use on a more intensive zone, no problem, but you can't build a more intensive use on a less intensive zone. So, if you have land that's zoned R60 or R90, except under the very limited circumstances Lisa's talking about, like a duplex or an accessory dwelling unit, you can't build anything other than a single family house. And even in those very limited cases, it's extremely complicated and there's a lot of barriers to being able to do that. So if we redefine what an R90 or R60 zone means to say you can put up to, R6, by the way, I should clear up some jargon here just because for the uninitiated. What does R60 mean? R60 is short for our residential 6,000, meaning you can have one house if you have 6,000 square feet of dirt. R90 is residential 9,000. So if you have 9,000 square feet of land, you can put one house on it. So if you think about it, you could say, okay, the definition of R60 maybe should be one house if you have 6,000 square feet, but maybe you could have 3 units on 10,000 square feet. So if you could assemble a slightly larger piece of land, maybe you could have a triplex or a quad. So you could write the rules to say whatever you want. It's really not difficult to set an upper limit. In fact, that's what zoning always does. It basically sets an upper limit on what can be built there. So if we as a community decided, hey, we think it's good to introduce some of these missing middle housing types in single family neighborhoods, but we don't want to see apartment buildings, or certainly not big apartment buildings, not 200-foot apartment buildings. You can impose height limits, you can impose floor area ratio limits, you can impose the limit on the number of units. And so you could that's pretty straightforward to do.
I think the main thing is here is we're just trying to create more flexibility and to not have single family zoning be a barrier to development in Montgomery County. And we will look at this very strategically at policy-wide and through our master plans. And we encourage you to get involved and let us know what you want to see in your neighborhood.
Thanks, Lisa and Casey. So little known fact about Lisa is she's actually an excellent cocktail and mocktail maker, connoisseur, if you will. So Lisa has offered to also share one of her favorite recipes, which we always enjoy at the planning department. And maybe you can use some of her secrets. She's set up her kitchen nicely. So Lisa, would you like to share with us, and then we'll dive into the rest of these questions?
Sure. So Maureen told me in no uncertain terms I'm not allowed to have hard liquor during this. So you will be getting a white wine spritzer, which has been my staple of quarantine. And I'll walk you through it. So first, we have frozen fruit that I bought when I told myself I was going to drink a smoothie every morning because I had time. Spoiler, I did not drink any smoothies in quarantine. And then we also have a wine. So I have a rosé that I got from the wine subscription delivery system, Wink. Fun fact about this, I bought this because it was aesthetically pleasing. And this label is scratch and sniff. So it smells like watermelon. And then you need a seltzer, water. I like the Polarade. As my coworkers know, I'm a big seltzer fan. So I've been through it all. I live in a 600 square foot apartment. So getting a lot of supplies for quarantine was hard, but I did buy like 10 boxes of seltzer. So that was like how I prepare for quarantine. So first you just need to like put your frozen fruit in, and it also serves as an ice cube, which is helpful. Okay, now I should open it. And then just pour your wine in your seltzer and mix it, and it's fine. It does the job. It's not Casey's special drink, but it works. It does what it needs to do. There we go. It also helps to have a kitchen that is also your office / living room / bedroom, because it's all right there.
Only Lisa could seamlessly tie making a drink in with housing policy. So thank you, Lisa. That was
Welcome.
lovely. So we have a question from Silky, and she said her background's a little loud, so I'm just going to go ahead and read it. Silky asks, have you studied the amount of housing that could be achieved by implementing, she said in quotes, gentle density transition within the county along existing transit corridors? Are there any obstacles that you're aware of?
Sure. So we actually are studying that right now. We have a residential capacity analysis where, one, we're looking at the existing zoning capacity of like the entire county based on constraints, market, environmental, zoning. And then we want to run some scenarios of what it would look like if we did model gentle density. So coming soon to a planning board hearing near you. I'm going to turn my shades down, be right back.
Well, I'd also just add to that, the good news and bad news is that I don't think any of this is going to happen very quickly, no matter what the zoning code says. That's good news because it means that we're unlikely to see a dramatic transformation in the character of any neighborhood anytime in the immediate future. And so I think that a lot of the people who are concerned about the impact of missing middle housing types, I think are maybe a little bit jumping the gun on how dramatic that change could be and what the potential is for that to disrupt people's expectations about, you know, the neighborhood that they thought they were buying into. The bad news, of course, is it means we're not going to probably see a lot of new units of any kind because this takes time. I mean, in Philadelphia, when they liberalized the accessory dwelling unit regulations several years ago, they found that about 1 out of every 1,000 lots where the owner could have theoretically added an ADU would actually do it in any given year. So, you know, Philadelphia is a big city, so there's many thousands of, you know, individual properties. And so that doesn't mean there's no accessory dwelling units being built. But I think just realistically, most people who, you know, buy a house are buying it because they want to live in it. They're not buying it because they're trying to maximize the real estate investment potential or because they want to create missing middle housing, create more opportunities for people to live in their neighborhood. And so really it's only over time as people, you know, move out, they sell, there's some neighbors or some investors who decide to try to assemble a few lots and try to find opportunities to put in, you know, a duplex or a triplex or a quadplex, that's going to happen over a period of, you know, a generation or more. So this is not a solution to affordable housing. And I often hear people say, well, if it's not, this won't solve affordable housing, so why are we even bothering? And I think the answer is that affordable housing is a huge problem that's going to require a whole bunch of different things. None of them are going to solve the problem. Subsidies will not, we don't have, all the golden Fort Knox is not enough to subsidize our way out of the affordable housing problem. Accessory dwelling units are not going to solve the problem. More apartment buildings in downtowns are not going to solve the problem. There's no one thing that's going to solve it. It's going to be a half dozen or more different approaches that are all going to have to work together. And even then we're going to struggle. But that doesn't mean that any one of them is not worth doing. In fact, we really need to pursue all of them. And I want to come back to this question earlier of, well, you know, isn't there an alternative to changing, you know, the zoning? I don't like the idea of more density, more of change that would affect our neighborhoods. And I think the problem is, the alternative is less affordable housing, higher prices, more people being priced out, all the obvious consequences of that, which I think everybody agree are bad. That's bad for our workforce. It's bad for economic competitiveness. It's bad for social and racial justice. The other consequence is that this is a dynamic region that has economic opportunities. We're really fortunate to live in the DC area that's attractive to lots and lots of people. If we don't find a way to accommodate more people living here, we're going to get more people in the region who will be commuting through here. And the consequences of sprawl for traffic congestion, with all of not just the environmental impacts that has with greenhouse gases, but also the impact that has on everyone's quality of life as people are trying to drive from Clarksburg to Tyson's Corner or Frederick County into Washington, D.C. or Howard County to, you know, points even in Silver Spring. That has negative consequences for our quality of life. So anybody who objects to this idea on the grounds that they would prefer that things stay just like they are, I would say things are not going to stay like they are. The increase in population jobs is inevitable, and we need to figure out the best way that we can adapt to that, not because we're embracing urbanization or density for its own sake, but because we recognize that the alternatives are all really negative in so many ways.
Thank you. I'm going to see, Brad had a number of questions, and I'm going to see if Brad is willing to unmute himself and talk. And if Brad, if you're not, then I'll just go ahead and read them myself, but I've asked to unmute you. Okay, no mic available. So Brad had a question about the MPDUs. He says he understands the value, but is there a study on the economic loss of a lower income household versus a full market price unit household?
I might need some clarification. So is he talking, is there a study on the economic loss of an MPDU or?
We'll have to get back to you. Brad, you can type in your clarification. And then I'm going to just jump over to Bill Leroy, who asks, how can MoCo encourage building up with an aging population? And Bill had also asked, for greenfield development, will developers be open to including multi-generational housing, such as a potential for expanding to accommodate seniors? So 2 questions about aging population and housing.
Sure. So one thing I want to say is that before Thrive, we did a number of studies about so many things. And one of them we did was older adult housing. And one of the most interesting things we found about our housing supply and how it fits for older adults is most older adults actually do want to age in place, about 7 out of 10. And actually only about 15% of Montgomery County seniors live in what we call age-restricted housing. And while we expect that to change, we need to figure out, you know, how do we get seniors to downsize and provide affordable options? Because it's hard when you have a paid off house in the suburbs to then ask them to take on a mortgage for a age restricted unit in downtown Bethesda. So there's a little bit of a process that we need to do to figure out, our own flexibility with zoning and making product more affordable so that they can either age in place or find a smaller product that fits their need. But there are definitely policies, actions, and recommendations about older adult housing in Thrive 2050. We have one of the oldest populations in the region, and we expect that to continue. So it will be a vital part of Montgomery County housing policy going forward. We just need to figure out how to make it work and to fit the needs of the residents. What was the next question?
And Brad has just followed up and he said, to the degree that a household in an MPDU household has lower property taxes, has a lower household income, and the loss of local economy expending, et cetera, has the economic loss difference been calculated such that the MPDU route can be data driven to a degree?
Sure. I mean, I think, when we look at MPDUs, they are a complete developer subsidy. That means that the developer subsidizes the unit from market to 65 or 70% AMI. And I don't know of anything where we looked at property taxes. When we did the Bethesda downtown plan and the Westbard plan, we did look at the cost of the MPDU when we were looking at going to 15%. For us, we provide some incentives too for providing more affordable housing in the terms of bonus density. So while I don't think we've looked at it quite that way, we have looked at the cost of the MPDU in terms of what it looks like to cover the cost of the unit through its lifetime.
And then one last question from Naya. She asks if the planners, and Lisa and Casey, for this, we're going to assume that you're also a planner, if you consider yourself environmentalists, and could you talk about how that influences your work, especially in housing?
Sure. So I'm going to beat Casey to the punch and say what he's always said is the best housing policy is a good environmental policy. When we talk about compact form and getting people near their jobs in transit, that's the best way to be a good environmental planner. And I do see myself as an environmental planner, and I think they're important. Like, one of the things for Thrive is we're talking about the interconnectedness between all of these things. It's not environment, housing, transportation, land use, they're all linked, and we need to look at them together. Casey, did I miss anything?
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's right. I mean, that's counterintuitive, but more urban form with a mix of uses that's compact, that is less reliant on driving long distances to get around, is the most environmentally benign form of development.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to actually throw in one last question. I've tried to get at least one question from everyone who's asked one. If we did not get to your questions tonight, we'll try to include them in our facts and have them up on our website. But this one comes from, I believe, Mike Ditka marauding as Tara. And it says, does gentle density get us enough housing? Should areas where apartment buildings be expanded? Should those areas be expanded?
The areas where apartment buildings should be allowed?
Yes. And here, I'll unmute Mike for a second.
Yeah, I meant to say, should areas where apartment buildings are allowed be expanded? And then will we ever get to a regime where apartment building is just allowed by right?
Well, there are parts of the county where there are small apartment buildings that predate the more restrictive zoning that exists now, that are sort of, they're non-conforming uses. Like, for example, on Sligo Avenue, just outside of downtown Silver Spring, in the single family neighborhoods in East Silver Spring, there are some small buildings that are probably, 20 plus units. I mean, they're typically, 3 stories, not garden apartments, but just very compact buildings that are on, what would probably be the equivalent of 3 or 4 single family lots. I don't know that we're going to get there anytime soon. Certainly, there are places. For example, in downtown Bethesda, with the downtown Bethesda plan we did a couple of years ago, there were a few single family houses in downtown Bethesda that were sort of allowed to remain in place. There's no encouragement or desire to see them go. But by the time the 2016 plan rolled around, the owners were ready to say, you know what, this doesn't really make any sense for anybody. We're ready to sell, and we'd like to see the zoning, accommodate some change. And what you see along Arlington Road now is some of those lots have been developed into mid-rise buildings. So I think in some limited ways, it's probably not realistic or even necessary or desirable to have apartment buildings everywhere. But certainly, there's a place for multifamily housing, I think, in every section of the county. It's not just about being near transit. For example, there's parts of, the up county that have centers of population and commerce that have to employ people to serve as, all the things that people need, the services they need to live their lives. And those people right now have to commute long distances because they can't afford to live in a big house on a big lot. So I think there's some role for multifamily everywhere. But I wouldn't say that we need to go to anything particularly ambitious to make some progress on this and really over time chip away at the problem of different housing types and affordability.
And there are some zones that, do allow standard methods for multifamily buildings at a very small FAR, like the CRN zone, I believe, was designed to be the standard method by right zone. And then I think the CR, if you have if you use a density of like 0.5, you are allowed to go by right. It's just very small densities that we allow to go by right, by design.
Yeah, one example that comes to mind is the Olney master plan. The Olney sort of crossroads of whatever it is, Georgia Avenue and 198 or whatever, that plan allows for some modest multifamily combined with some of the commercial and retail that's already there. We haven't seen a lot of interest. Nobody's really taken us up on that, but that's a place that could probably benefit from, some additional housing types that are suitable for people a little bit more modest income or people that just don't necessarily want to live or maintain a big house. And it would be great to see over time some of that, sort of like walk-up apartments or a couple levels of residential over the retail and what's now, kind of an out-of-date strip center, to see that kind of thing transform.
And office buildings too. The Octave in downtown Silver Spring was by right because they already had all the zoning and height that they need. So they just went straight to DPS for that adaptive reuse project. So there are opportunities and we're looking to make more. You're muted.
Yeah, I keep moving around my unmute, so hopefully I'm now unmuted. I was like moving myself around the screen and it was very challenging. So Lisa and Casey could definitely keep talking about this for hours, but unfortunately we've reached 6 p.m. So we know we got a lot of questions that we weren't able to answer this evening. We're going to work on answering them, and we can post the answers to our website, which is thrivemontgomery.com. If you are interested in receiving the link to those answers, you can send me your email privately through the chat, or you can also email thrive2050@montgomeryplanning.org. Lisa Gavoni also dropped her email address in the chat. She knows everything there is to know about housing from the planning department. So it's lisa.gavoni@montgomeryplanning.org. Feel free to reach out to her as well. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, send us a message and we'll get back to you. And we're gonna have a couple more of these chats. Next week, we're having one on design, arts, and culture, which is on Monday afternoon, and which can be found on our website, and also one on diverse and adaptable growth, which will deal with how we're growing as a county and also in the AgriServe. And that is next Tuesday night. So feel free to join us. And we really appreciate having you guys here. We're hoping to do more of these in the future. So also drop us a line and let us know if there are topics that you'd like to cover or anything that you'd like to see. And if you guys have any summer cocktail or mocktail recipes, we also like to hear that. And you can send us an email or let us know on social media what your favorites are. So thanks again for being here tonight. And hopefully we'll see you soon, either virtually or in person. Thank you guys.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everyone.
That was fun.